Welcome to the Horizon Audiofiles, a podcast of the Defense Horizon Journal. The Defense Horizon Journal is a professional and academic journal that features essays, reports, and analyses covering geopolitics and law, security and defense policy, peace and conflict studies, applied military science, as well as developments in weapons technology. For more information, go to www.tdhj.org.
Episode number 90. Building Energy Resilience Beyond the Strait of Hormuz. By Vipul Tom Honey. When the hypothetical became the emergency. The situation has developed from a theoretical status into urgent requirements as the U.S. Israeli military operations against Iranian facilities, which have caused the Strait of Hormuz to be choked by Iran as a retaliatory move against the offensive operation since 28 February 2026. Now, the 116-kilometer UAE corridor, which could connect Sharjah Port Khalid with Fujairah via an inland maritime corridor, could become the only operational bypass, serving as a viable plan to handle one-fifth of the world's daily oil supply. An opportunity for the UAE to capitalize on this permanent solution. The potential closure of the Strait of Hormuz has become an extreme situation which military simulations and geopolitical studies must have tested their boundaries. The situation has developed into a practical matter of clear and present danger now, since February 28, 2026. On February 26, the U.S. Israeli coalition forces targeted multiple military and strategic Iranian targets with missile strikes, which led to the IRGC, Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, of Iran calling the Strait of Hormuz dangerous because its waters would aid the U.S. fleet to strike deep in their territory. Maritime traffic through the chokepoint has declined by more than 90% since then. The disruption has continued for almost 2 weeks at this point, and the world has already experienced severe consequences from it. The world has experienced interruptions which affect 17 to 20 million barrels of oil per day, which equals almost one-fifth of the total global oil supply. The oil-exporting nations of Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, and the UAE are pushed to reduce their oil production because their storage capacity has reached maximum limits and their tankers are unable to leave the region. The major importing economies, which include the People's Republic of China, PRC, India, Japan, and South Korea, now face rising fuel costs, leading to greater inflationary pressures. The oil price forecast shows that prices will exceed $120 per barrel, as they have already fluctuated between $105 and $119 in a single day. The economists predict that extended disruptions will cause a global economic recession. The crisis which energy analysts had predicted for many years now exists in reality. The emergency situation demands a strategic outlook and seeks emergency support as an infrastructure asset which needs to be built either as a pipeline, a rail route, or a full-fledged canal, Suez Canal style, across the UAE as a cross-peninsula corridor which connects Sharjah Port Khalid with the Port of Fujairah area near the Fujairah Corniche that exists on the Gulf of Oman. At approximately 116 kilometers, it could prove to be a viable bypass of the Strait of Hormuz. This may not look like a solution, but in a crisis of this magnitude engulfing the world, a partial solution for now, with even a small bypass capacity, adds redundancy, stabilizes markets during disruptions, and buys time for oil-dry importing states to adjust through reserves, diversified supply, and alternative maritime routes. From threat to reality. Iran's doctrine of chokepoint deterrence was always premised on a credible threat that did not need to be executed to be effective. The fear of closure was enough to discipline global shipping, moderate Western military adventurism, and extract diplomatic leverage. That calculus changed during this conflict. After the strikes on Iranian targets, Tehran moved from threat to action. The IRGC warned ships they would be set ablaze if they entered the waterway. Major shipping companies and their insurers needed no second warning. The mechanism of closure has not required a single naval battle. Iran temporarily shut down the strait through the combination of available missile systems, drone capacity, fast attack boats, and Gulf tanker attack evidence from 2019, Kokuka Courageous, Panama flagged, and Front Altair, Marshall Islands flagged, which, together with rising war risk insurance costs, created a new reality. The current situation shows that hundreds of vessels have stopped operating and are waiting outside the region. The strait is closed, in functional terms. Why the UAE is the only country with an answer. No other Gulf state possesses the UAE's geographic fortune. The closest Indian Ocean access point to Saudi Arabia is more than 1,200 kilometers away from its Gulf coastal region. Kuwait, Iraq, and Qatar all exist within the Persian Gulf territory, but they lack any access to the Indian Ocean. The UAE controls the smallest land passage between the Arabian Peninsula territories, which extends from Sharjah to Fujairah through a distance of 116 kilometers. The UAE has already proved that the concept works. The Abu Dhabi crude oil pipeline, which extends 370 kilometers from Habshan oil fields to Fujairah, operates as a complete system outside the Strait of Hormuz after requiring more than $2.7 billion for its construction. The design team constructed the structure to handle this specific situation. It is operational now. The question is not whether the bypass concept is viable, but rather how rapidly it can be scaled. From strategic asset to emergency hub. The Port of Fujairah is already one of the world's largest bunkering ports, the third largest globally by volume, with enormous oil storage capacity and direct access to Indian Ocean tanker routes linking the Middle East to India, East Asia, and Europe. In the current crisis, it has moved from a background strategic asset to a frontline logistics node. Tankers that can still operate are routing to Fujairah. All that was destined for Hormuz transit is being redirected, where infrastructure permits, through the Habshan pipeline. This is precisely why Iranian strategists had long regarded Fujairah with unease even before the current hostilities. Iran's chokepoint leverage rested on the assumption that Gulf exporters had no alternative. The existence of a functioning bypass, however limited in capacity, undermines that assumption in real time. Every barrel moving through the Habshan-Fujairah pipeline, also known as Abu Dhabi Crude Oil Pipeline, ADCOP, today, is a barrel that Iran's closure cannot touch. At 1.5 million barrels per day, that is approximately 7 to 9% of the disrupted flow, insufficient to stabilize markets alone, but sufficient to demonstrate that the bypass concept is operational, scalable, and worth protecting. However, this is a limited resource and not sufficient or practical in the long term, not to mention costly. Here, the UAE can embark upon a long-term yet opportunistic option to connect Jebel Ali to the Fujairah port, via a pipeline, a rail corridor or a Sharjah Port Khalid to Fujairah port inland maritime canal. The investment case, now immediate, not hypothetical. In peacetime, cross-peninsula export infrastructure in the UAE could reasonably be viewed as strategic insurance, costly relative to routine operations but justified by the systemic economic risk posed by disruption to the Strait of Hormuz. The current crisis alters that calculation. With maritime traffic through the strait severely disrupted, global oil markets have experienced significant supply shocks and price volatility, imposing substantial economic costs on both exporters and importing economies. Under such conditions, expanding existing bypass infrastructure, particularly pipeline capacity linking Gulf production to Fujairah on the Gulf of Oman, becomes strategically more compelling. While major pipeline construction projects typically require several years from planning to completion, emergency expansion measures, such as debottlenecking existing infrastructure, adding pumping capacity, or building parallel segments, could potentially increase throughput on shorter timelines. In this context, investments in bypass capacity should be evaluated not only in terms of construction costs but also in light of the broader economic risks posed by prolonged disruption in the Strait of Hormuz. The arithmetic is stark. Against a 90-day total disruption threatening $21 billion in UAE export value alone, not counting the broader global economic damage from oil above $100 per barrel, soaring freight costs, and inflation across Asia, a $4 billion pipeline expansion is not an investment question. This move will come from a war, emergency, expenditure, but with an opportunity for massive ROI. To avoid further catastrophic losses, the question for the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and their energy exporting partners is not whether to build, but how fast. The extended blockage or tactical weakness of the Strait of Hormuz poses a major threat to global energy routes, leading to renewed exploration of alternative sea routes connecting various points on the Arabian Peninsula. The study investigates whether building an inland canal to connect Fujairah on the Gulf of Oman with Port Khalid in Sharjah on the Persian Gulf can achieve its goal of creating a 110 to 125 kilometer bypass route which will function like the Suez Canal in the Gulf area. The study creates a cost and schedule assessment system which considers the specific geological difficulties that the Hajj mountain range presents through its assessment of 3 infrastructure projects: the Suez Canal expansion, the Dubai-Arabian Canal, and the Saudi Salwa Canal. The estimated construction expenses will range between $70 billion and $100 billion, and will require approximately 6 to 8 years for completion according to standard timelines, but can be shortened to 4 to 6 years during wartime operations, given the recurring threat in the West Asia region. The research assesses advanced engineering techniques that use autonomous excavation systems, simultaneous tunnel boring machine operation, and extensive dredging fleets to speed up construction processes. The evaluation of a hybrid pipeline rail corridor provides operational benefits that approach 80% of the total strategic advantage, while requiring an investment of $20 to $40 billion and taking 2 to 3 years to complete construction. The research shows that a complete navigable canal project stands as one of the most difficult engineering projects of contemporary times, but the sustained disruption of the Hormuz Strait makes its strategic and economic reasons more convincing. Fujairah as a strategic target. Any serious analysis of the UAE corridor must grapple with the Iranian strategic response. Iran's closure of the strait derives from its asymmetric control of a chokepoint, a posture that has defined its deterrence doctrine for decades. The emergence of a functioning Hormuz bypass directly erodes this leverage. For every barrel that exits through Fujairah rather than the strait, Iran's most powerful geopolitical instrument loses potency. It is therefore not merely plausible but strategically logical to anticipate Iranian action against the corridor itself. Any serious assessment of the proposed UAE energy corridor must account for how Iran might respond to infrastructure that reduces the Strait of Hormuz strategic leverage. For decades, Iran's deterrence posture in the Gulf has relied partly on its ability to threaten disruption of the chokepoint through missiles, naval forces, and asymmetric tactics. The expansion of export routes that bypass the strait, such as pipelines or logistics corridors linking the UAE's Gulf coast to Fujairah on the Gulf of Oman, would not eliminate this leverage but could gradually dilute it by providing limited redundancy for Gulf energy exports. As a result, such infrastructure would likely acquire strategic significance in Iranian planning during a crisis. Potential responses could range from diplomatic pressure and cyber operations against energy infrastructure to proxy sabotage or maritime harassment in nearby waters. In a higher-intensity conflict scenario, missile or drone strikes against regional energy facilities cannot be excluded. Energy infrastructure in the Gulf has repeatedly proven vulnerable during periods of escalation, including attacks on tankers and major oil installations in recent years. Iran has shown its ability to deploy drone swarm techniques against oil facilities, while the 2019 Abqaiq Quraiz attacks on Saudi Aramco infrastructure remain the most significant attack because they used systems that have improved since that time. Iran has maintained a gray zone capability which it uses to execute covert sabotage operations against pipeline SCADA systems and terminal infrastructure. Iranian proxy networks maintain their ability to endanger maritime operations throughout the Gulf of Oman and Arabian Sea region. The military implication is clear: expansion and operation of the Fujairah corridor cannot be treated as a purely civil engineering project. It requires active air defense, hardened underground pipeline segments, dispersed storage architecture, and naval protection of the sea lanes connecting Fujairah to the open ocean. This is, fundamentally, a combined military infrastructure operation. The coalition forming around Fujairah. The Port Khalid, Sharjah, Fujairah bypass corridor operating under fire will not survive without external security guarantees, and the crisis has begun to clarify who will provide them. The United States, already party to the strikes that triggered the closure, has both the naval infrastructure and the strategic obligation to protect the corridor's sea lane access. The U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet remains the dominant force in the region. India, which imports a substantial share of its crude from Gulf states and whose Arabian Sea neighborhood directly encompasses these tanker routes, has both the naval capacity and the acute economic incentive to escort traffic from Fujairah to the open ocean. Japan and South Korea, near entirely dependent on Gulf hydrocarbons, face an energy emergency that would demand their maritime participation. The PRC's position is the most consequential variable. As the world's largest energy importer and the country with perhaps the most to lose from a prolonged Gulf disruption, Beijing faces an incentive structure that pulls it toward protecting the corridor even as its political posture resists alignment with a US-led coalition. The most likely outcome will see Chinese Navy forces handle supply route protection for Chinese-flagged or Chinese-chartered ships, while Western military units will provide assistance with corridor protection through informal collaboration. This is not coalition warfare. It is a convergent interest expressed through maritime presence. The strategic case for the Sharjah Fujairah energy corridor. One critical pathway stands central to worldwide fuel distribution. Through it flows roughly 20 to 21 million barrels each day, a volume matching nearly one-fifth of total daily oil demand across nations, while accounting for about 20% of maritime petroleum movement globally. These supplies originate primarily from Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, Iran, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates. Despite its narrow reach on maps, its influence spreads far beyond regional boundaries. Where geography concentrates traffic, economic ripple effects follow unpredictably. The energy flows to Asian economies, which use large amounts of energy, and the PRC, India, Japan, and South Korea are their main markets. The narrow navigational channel, which has its narrowest point at 33 to 39 kilometers, serves as the maritime route through which more than $500 billion in annual energy trade moves between two restricted geographic areas. Such concentration creates a single-point systemic vulnerability, which energy economists call a systemic vulnerability that affects the entire global energy system. The Gulf states face economic risks because their economies depend heavily on the strait, which serves as their main export route for hydrocarbons. Approximately 70 to 75% of Saudi Arabia's oil exports, 98% of Iraq's exports, nearly all of Kuwait's exports, around 70% of UAE exports, and roughly 90% of Qatar's liquefied natural gas shipments pass through the strait. Gulf economies would lose between $1 and $1.2 billion in daily revenue at an oil price of $100 per barrel if 10 million BPD of exports were disrupted. The export revenue loss over 6 months would reach between $180 to $220 billion, while the annual losses for the UAE would exceed $20 to $30 billion. The economic risks which exist today demonstrate that energy export corridors which operate independently from the Strait of Hormuz have become essential for strategic development. Within this context, the proposed Sharjah Fujairah energy corridor represents a pragmatic attempt to diversify export routes by exploiting the UAE's dual-coast geography. The 48-inch crude oil pipeline, which travels through this route, will have the capacity to move between 1.5 million and 2 million barrels per day. The UAE will achieve an export capacity of 3 to 4 million barrels per day, using the existing Habshan Fujairah pipeline, which currently transports 1.5 to 1.8 million barrels per day. The capacity, which will operate at 15 to 20% of current oil flows through Hormuz, will provide substantial support to regional energy operations during times of geopolitical unrest. The pipeline corridor and the inland maritime canal function as separate systems, each with specific capacity requirements and cost structures. Capacity assessment: pipeline corridor versus inland maritime canal. The corridor development process will enable incremental construction progress for the pipeline system and the inland maritime canal system. A single pipeline capable of transporting 2 million BPD would likely require an investment of $4 to $6 billion, while twin pipelines could expand capacity to 4 million BPD at a cost of $8 to $10 billion. Theoretical research indicates that multi-pipeline systems can achieve greater export capacity through 4 pipelines, which would deliver 8 million barrels per day of outgoing shipments. A pipeline network that fully replaces Hormuz throughput would require approximately 20 million BPD of capacity. This network requires 10 pipelines, which will demand between $40 billion and $60 billion in total investments. The table below compares the two principal infrastructure options against the current Hormuz throughput. Engineering constraints and realistic timelines. Policy discussions on energy matters need to recognize that constructing extensive energy systems will take longer than they currently believe. A 116-kilometer-long, large-diameter crude oil pipeline crossing mixed desert and mountainous terrain would normally require feasibility studies and environmental assessment, 6 to 12 months, engineering design and procurement, 6 to 12 months, construction and installation, 18 to 24 months, and testing and commissioning, 3 to 6 months. The complete project would take between 4 and 6 years, even when using faster strategic methods. The main barrier to the construction of a Trans-Emirates canal is the Hajj Mountains, which rise to heights above 1,800 meters and consist mainly of arpheolite rock formations. The uneven material and fault line arrangements of these rocks create major difficulties for tunneling operations. A canal designed to handle large crude carriers requires a 200-300 meter wide channel that must reach a depth of 20 to 25 meters, and it requires excavation of over 2 to 3 billion cubic meters of rock and sediment. This makes the project one of the largest civil engineering projects in modern times. The expansion of the Suez Canal took 1 year to complete an additional 72-kilometer channel, while the Panama Canal lock expansion took almost 9 years to finish. The geological conditions of the UAE interior present more challenges, which will extend the construction time of a Sharjah Fujairah maritime canal to 10 to 15 years. Engineering evaluations indicate that pipeline corridors have a higher likelihood of success than maritime canals over the medium-term planning period. Asian demand and the scale of structural dependency. The assessment of Gulf export bypass corridors needs to consider the energy requirements of major Asian countries, including the PRC, Japan, and South Korea, which are their primary importers. Daily, the PRC takes in 11 to 12 million barrels of crude oil, with roughly 40 to 45% sourced from Gulf producers. From Japan comes a flow of nearly 3.2 to 3.5 million barrels each day, most, nearly 9/10, traced back to the same region. South Korea brings in around 2.8 to 3.0 million barrels daily, with 7 out of 10 coming from those exporters. Combined, these nations use between 10 and 12 million barrels of oil originating in the Gulf, accounting for much of what moves through the Hormuz Strait. This strait holds weight since its shipments mostly head eastward, 84% land on Asian shores. Due to these patterns, alternate routes gain quite significance here. With a spare route capable of carrying 2 to 4 million barrels daily, output flows continue even when main paths halt, limiting gaps in deliveries to Asian buyers. When markets are unstable, moving 2 million barrels overseas each day could yield nearly $200 million if oil stays at $100 per barrel, helping prevent sudden jumps in global rates. Far from replacing Hormuz, this route is one piece of a shifting framework meant to steady energy flows under pressure. Route optimization, environmental considerations, and financing. Planning the path aims to reduce impact on communities. Starting from Sharjah's industrial area, the movement goes into Sharjah's logistics hub. From there, progress moves across Madam's arid stretch. Crossing the Hajj range happens via underground passages. Descent follows toward Masafi prior to arrival at Fujairah's energy sector. Within a zones holding few people, around 5,000 individuals may face changes. Land needs stand at around 3,000 hectares. Existing industrial or unused desert plots could host much of what is required. Urban interference stays low through such placement. Environmental factors will influence how work unfolds. The Hajj Mountains shelter fragile natural systems, whereas underground water reserves in arid zones may be disturbed when construction begins. Because heat levels are high across the area, metal decay and structural weakening along pipelines become more probable. To respond, methods such as precision boring beneath terrain, using alloys that resist rust, installing digital monitoring for spills, and replanting native species to restore damaged land appear necessary. Paying for the route might come from state-backed financial entities, global development lenders, and alliances within the power industry. Core capital could come from Emirati public holdings. The UAE's major sovereign wealth funds, its industrial growth arm, including the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority, Mubadala, and ADQ, could provide core capital, all of which are capable of anchoring large-scale investment. Outside contributions may flow through groups such as the Asia-focused Bank for Physical Projects or asset managers focused on transport networks tied to fuel supply chains. Should energy producers and trading entities like ADNOC, along with global oil firms, take part strategically, financial exposure may spread more widely, with business motivations becoming better aligned. When crises occur, faster progress could depend on government-supported energy security instruments, collaborative funding groups or international investment consortia. Geopolitical implications and long-term energy geography. As for broader consequences tied to power balances and future energy routes, building a route around the Strait of Hormuz brings shifts that unfold alongside its advancement. Such projects might be seen by Iran as moves to weaken its influence over sea-based fuel transport. Shifting trade flows may offer Oman new revenue streams, while Saudi Arabia might respond by pushing ahead with pipelines to the Red Sea. The International Energy Security Doctrine acknowledges energy transport route diversification as an essential method for reducing systemic risk. There is widespread energy transport route diversification worldwide. The Sharjah Fujairah corridor will help establish global energy market stability through its full implementation. The establishment of a 2 million BPD alternative export route will reduce the intensity of emergency price spikes by maintaining additional export capabilities beyond those controlled by the Strait of Hormuz. The corridor will provide Asian energy importers with greater supply security, as their economies rely on Gulf oil resources. The export route will reduce maritime insurance costs and shipping hazards arising from geopolitical conflicts by operating in non-confrontational maritime areas. The project will reshape the energy landscape of West Asia throughout its extended life. The UAE will create a permanent Hormuz bypass system through its dual-coast export system, thereby enhancing Fujairah's capabilities as an oil storage and export facility. The existing storage facilities in Fujairah will enable the emirate to become the largest oil storage and trading hub which exists beyond the Strait of Hormuz, thus establishing its new position in international energy distribution. Such structural diversification would dilute the geopolitical leverage of maritime chokepoints and contribute to a more resilient, diversified global energy system. The corridor is no longer a contingency. The strategic insight embedded in the UAE's dual-coast geography is no longer theoretical. With the Strait of Hormuz sealed off, weeks have passed without relief. Ship movements collapsed, falling below 90% of normal levels. Prices responded sharply, crude climbed past $100 a barrel. Production declines across Gulf exporting regions stem from terminal capacity limits alongside vessel delays. What once appeared in forecasts only as an extreme outcome now emerges visibly, causing market shifts. Here, the stretch linking Port Khalid, Sharjah, to Fujairah, measuring 116 kilometers, has shifted in role due to changing demands. Once seen as a strategic advantage, it now supports daily operations by carrying crude oil. Flow through the pipeline originating in Abu Dhabi continues without interruption. Fujairah is receiving redirected cargoes. But 1.5 million barrels per day is approximately 7 to 9% of the disrupted flow, a pressure valve in a system that needs a dam. Expanding the corridor, adding parallel pipeline capacity, accelerating Etihad Rail's freight integration, and building strategic reserves at Fujairah are not long-term infrastructure proposals. They are emergency actions whose economic justification was established in the first week of the closure itself. The situation at the Strait of Hormuz may eventually return to normal. Diplomatic pressure, military exhaustion, or a negotiated pause could restore some traffic within weeks. However, the crisis has demonstrated, with brutal clarity, that the global economy had no redundancy built into its most critical energy route. The UAE corridor is the world's only partial answer. It must be expanded, hardened, and protected, not after the next crisis, but during this one. Author, Vipul Tom Honey is a geoeconomic expert specializing in counter-terrorism, anti-money laundering, and combating the financing of terrorism. He holds an MBA in International Business from Symbiosis International University and an LLM in International Commercial Law from Northumbria University. His research interests are in the fields of multilateral defense, national security, counter-terrorism, geopolitics, diplomacy, financial crime, money laundering, terrorism financing. He works with financial institutions, regulatory agencies, and law enforcement to enhance financial crime risk management and compliance systems. Vipul serves as visiting faculty at Pune University's Department of Defense and Strategic Studies and trains officers at Premier Police Academies VIS, CPR, and MIA in India. His strategic commentary appears in global journals. He is a columnist at the South Asia Times, USA. The views contained in this article are the author's alone.
This was the Horizon Audiofiles, a podcast of the Defense Horizon Journal. For more information, go to www.tdhj.org. Thank you for listening.